Wisconsin commercial real estate women. What was that? All good? Oh, 1 second. Technical difficulties.
You're good now.
Where's that? Okay, cool. So W Crew's mission is to connect diverse commercial real estate professionals through education, collaboration, and the promotion of women. So we do have male members, but we are all unified in this sole mission. Several benefits of being a part of our organization. We are primarily a networking based organization, but we do have many professional development opportunities, volunteer opportunities, educational opportunities, etc. We are also part of a larger Crew network, which is a global organization of many Crew chapters, which gives us access to members nationwide. You never have to do a cold call, as well as a lot of industry research and benchmark studies. Just a couple of upcoming events we wanted to bring your attention to. We do have events in Madison. We've recently kind of branched out into that market. So we do have a coffee connection once a month there coming up on April 6th, as well as our annual awards banquet. We highlight local projects that have had particular impact on their community. That is April 22nd at the Brookfield Convention Center. So we would love to see you there. I will hand it over to Kathleen.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kathleen Ellis. I am the president of our local Wisconsin Ashrae chapter. So welcome, everybody. And thanks for coming today. Just a reminder, our upcoming chapter meetings is going to be our presidential visit on April 16th. So would love to see all of you guys there to hear about the Ashrae Society presidential address this year. So we're excited to have that happening this coming month. We don't always do this at the beginning of our meetings, but since we're having a collaborative event this time, figured we would just talk a little bit about Ashrae Society and our mission and what Ashrae is all about. So Ashrae Society is our national Ashrae organization with a mission to serve humanity by enhancing the arts and sciences of heating, ventilation, refrigeration, and air conditioning. National Ashrae has 53,000 members, 3 councils and a board of directors, over 100 staff, and 3 office locations. Some of the primary things that Ashrae Society does, which is our national society for Ashrae, we have 42 active research projects with over $6 million in total research that is happening actively by Ashrae. And a lot of that research and committees are dedicated to the development of our building standards around energy. And so our speaker today has actually chaired some of those committees. So we're excited to have her here today. And these are just some of the standards and codes that you may have heard of before, maybe not if you are dedicated to commercial real estate only. But some of those are our 90.1 standard, 62.1, and standard 55 are some of the common Ashrae codes. And then just some other updates from our local chapter here. We have about 400 members locally for the Wisconsin chapter. And we are looking for members for our chapter leadership. So if people would like to nominate yourself or a colleague for chapter leadership, please go ahead and do that on our website. And we also have our chapter technology awards coming up. So if you have an exciting project that you've been part of, we would love to have you submit for our chapter technology awards. Those are due on April 8th, and more information can be found on our website. So I'm going to hand it over to Gustavo to intro our speaker today.
Everyone, before I get started on the intro, there is a sign-in sheet in the back if you could sign in and pass it around. Also for Ashrae members, if you could fill out the DL evaluation form. Lastly, if you need a attendance certificate, if you can see Haley for that certificate, or you can send her an email, she'll send it to you digitally. And with that, we'll get started on the intro here. So today we'll have Dr. Teresa Weston presenting. She's an Ashrae Distinguished Lecturer. She graduated with a bachelor's in chemical engineering from MIT. After graduating, she spent 25 years at DuPont. Something really exciting is she helped come up with 4 patents while she was at DuPont. In the last year and a half, Dr. Weston started her own consultancy and specializes in building sustainability. So today she'll be talking about women in STEM. And for me personally, this is something really interesting I did the math yesterday and 75% of my cousins are women. So I want to see them succeed. Right now I have a cousin studying architecture. So it's really exciting and interested in the insights that Dr. Weston will give us.
Okay, thanks everyone. And so I'm going to tell you a little more about my biography as we go through. What? Which? Oh. I'll let you. Okay, all right, whatever. Okay, so I'm going to talk about diversity and what we can do in our businesses to improve diversity, where we are in diversity. And I'm focusing on women as the sort of case study that I'm talking about, which fits in well with your organization. And it also is the most visible part of my diversity, I think, is that I'm female. So particularly in science and engineering, where we're underrepresented. But it still follows for other groups. This is I am part of the Distinguished Lecturer Program from Ashrae. And just a little bit of housekeeping. There are evaluation forms that Gustavo already mentioned. The lecturer presentations and opinions are not reflective of official policies or positions of the Ashrae or its chapter. So so I'm responsible for the content. Just, yeah, Ashrae is not. And then if you want more information about the Distinguished Lecturer Program, you can go to that website. And the next is that Ashrae is looking for leadership in its committees, both its national committees, technical and standards committees, which is what I worked in primarily, as well as young engineers at Ashrae and chapter membership. And Ashrae, although it is the name comes from American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, it's not all mechanical engineers. Plenty of us are building envelope materials, building scientists. There are also people who work in environment and comfort in buildings and public health professionals in there. And so it is useful to get involved in some of the activities in Ashrae. You may find something in there that you wouldn't think of as just an air conditioning engineer or an HVAC engineer in there. So please become involved. Okay, and March is Women's History Month. So, and about a week ago was the International Day for Women and Girls in Science. And so this is a good time to kick off a presentation on the diversity in the STEM fields. And so, but we don't have to just celebrate women's history.
Can everybody online hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. What?
Yeah, you're good.
Good, okay, all right. Okay, we'll go through some statistics on the status of women in STEM fields, and then talk about how we have increased diversity and inclusion over the years of my career, and also what we can do to increase them in the future. And they come down to a few simple ideas. Intertwined with this discussion, I'm going to put in my story. And my story is I have a bachelor's, master's, and PhD, all in chemical engineering. Bachelor's from MIT, master's and PhD from Caltech. I worked for DuPont for slightly over 35 years as a building scientist for 25. And then took an early retirement and started my own consulting company. which I'm focusing on doing code advocacy and working with a lot of building codes and energy code developments. So I've been through a lot of phases of my career. I've been going for, if you add in my college and graduate school experience, over 40 years working in STEM as a woman. So I've seen a lot of changes, most of them for the good. And I'm going to intertwine some of that in some of the more drier statistics area and tell some stories. So we'll start with what is diversity. And I think we put things in bins, and we naturally put things in bins as a human being. There are social science surveys and research that have shown that children as young as a year old will put things in bins and people in bins, and they will start distinguishing between people. So it's natural to say that is a woman, that is a man, and divide the world that way. The idea of diversity is not that you don't want to see those and you don't want to do the bins, but that you equally value all of the different bins together, and you take their value and build them together so the sum is actually, so the whole is actually greater than the sum. Or so we talk a lot about committees. We're seeing a lot of things, and we've reduced them to their acronym, DE&I. You got to have three. So we've diversity, equity, and inclusion. And diversity, and these are just some definitions that I found online and in some of the social science research articles. Diversity is the inclusion of people of different races, genders, cultures, political beliefs, sexual orientations, religions, social classes, etc. A lot of different things can be considered diverse attributes, and it's just the inclusion of them. Equity is basically being fair and impartial across and making sure that there is equal opportunity across those. Inclusion is everyone in the diverse mix feels involved, valued, respected, treated fairly, and embedded in your culture. So if you have diversity, but you do not have inclusion, it can result in a toxic culture where you just have a lot of groups that everybody is binning separately, but they're not including them. If you have inclusion, but you don't have diversity, everybody's the same. In the world of science, that often is a world that's all white men, and you have inclusion of all white men, your company can become stagnant and uncreative because you're not bringing in ideas from outside. So diversity and inclusion need to be worked on together. And equity is basically what I would call sort of the basic. If you don't have equity, you're starting off way too far behind where you need to be. In the 60s and 70s, particularly when we started the EEOs, the Equal Employment Opportunity Office, and started looking at getting some of the laws in about treating people equally and not discriminating on the basis of diversity, we talked mainly about age and race and gender and some physical attributes that you could see almost immediately as somebody walked in a room. But when we look at diversity today, we're actually looking at the seen and unseen differences. So we're looking at things like differences in talent, different in thinking styles, differences in culture, and in things like family status. And the idea is that all of these different lived experiences and attributes can come together and provide more richness and more creativity in an organization. So diversity isn't just counting the number of men and women in an organization. It's about these greater ideas of differences in diversity. And this is from a Harvard Business Review article, but there's several other articles that introduce the idea of multidimensional diversity. And I've seen it up to 7 dimensions, but I'm going to stick with 2 because it's the simplest way to work through this. And they talk about inherent and acquired diversity. So inherent diversity involves what you were born with. I was born female, I was born white, female, there was sexual orientation. Acquired diversity is what you acquire as you live your life, your experiences, and what that diversity brings on. And so one way of understanding this, and I'm going to use myself as an example, is to look at your own personal diversity, figure out how you are diverse. Because not all women are the same. You can have diversity within a women's group. So if you look at what you were born with, and that's a picture of me as a very small baby with my mom and my older sister, I was born with three things that I think are really important to my current diversity. One is that's my ancestry.com DNA profile. I'm unapologetically Western European. There's nothing in there except Western European. It's sort of boring, but it's there. And I was born female to my mom, and I was born 11 months after my parents moved to the country. I'm a daughter of immigrants from England. And my parents had lived in 3 countries beforehand. And although that might be acquired diversity, it actually, from my birth, I always had an extended family that was globally. And it's changed the way I deal with the world because I am more connected, particularly with the British Isles, but also with Australia and other areas because I have relatives in them. And so that is a form of diversity. You won't see that when I walk in the room, but I was sort of born with it. When you look at acquired diversity, I'm not going to go through all of these things, but where I went to school, where I grew up, where I like vacationing, my husband, what my hobbies are, those are all part that I bring with me. And many of them have influenced what I can bring to a workplace. Some of them don't, but they will, my outlook on the world is all included in that. And this is something you can do at home. You can look at what you were born with and what you acquired. And you can get a view of where your own diversity comes from. And if you start valuing your own diversity, you can value other people's diversity on there. And this brings us to the Marley Hypothesis, which is Bob Marley sang, and I will not sing because that is painful to people, but if you know your history, then you would know where you're coming from. And in social sciences, they actually describe something called the Marley Hypothesis, which is the history of people, the history of institutions affect who they are today. So this could go to your acquired diversity. On the negative side, it can also go to your inherent biases and an institution's inherent biases. And so the history of an institution can be reflected, and you may have to do more work to change one institution than another based on what its past history is. And my example from my history are the 2 institutes of technology that I went to school. I entered Caltech as a graduate student in 1980, and that was the 10th year anniversary of them accepting women into their undergraduate program. They started accepting women in 1970. In fact, in the 1930s, they didn't even allow women as secretaries on site because they would cause the men who were doing important scientific work to be distracted. Evidently, the men were somewhat easily distracted. I don't know. So I entered the school, and it did not have a long history of really being supportive of women. Now, I had come from another institute of technology. Again, when I started MIT, there were only about 20% of the population, student population, were female, but they had had a long history. And so this picture shows the Women's Alumni Association from 1899. They had a long history of accepting women, and there were a lot more institutional, even though, yes, they had to do a bathroom tour so that you could find the women's bathrooms on site because they were all hidden in corners. They had a long history of actually having women be part of the community. And you could feel the difference between the 2 schools. As a woman, it's a non-tangible feel, but you could sort of feel the difference in the history. The other thing about MIT that I felt influenced their diversity is, this is their motto is at top, mens et manus, and it means minds and hands. And they had a history of both craftsmanship as part of their training, as well as scientific learning. And so the idea of bringing together craftsmanship and and scientific exploration was part and parcel of the MIT history and their thought and that institution. And so the difference between the two institutions, although they were both top 5 scientific institutes of technology, was really different because of the histories of those institutions. And I think that's an important story to learn. So I'm going to switch over, and what I don't have is a timer here. Oh, yes, I do. I talk about the value of diversity, and gender equality is number 5 on the UN sustainability goals. And the UN states, ending all discrimination against women and girls is not only a basic human right, it's crucial for sustainable future. It's proven that empowering women and girls helps economic growth and development. And this is from the UN. They have clear sustainability goals. A lot of governments and businesses have adopted sustainability goals to go after. And I really can't say it any better than what the UN says. Ashrae also has a diversity commitment for those of you who are here from Ashrae. I won't read it all, but I like the first sentence, which is Ashrae is committed to providing a welcoming environment. And I'm not sure we've all always felt that at every Ashrae meeting, but hopefully we will in the future. Welcoming, and they're looking for inclusiveness and acknowledging the value and dignity, the inherent value and dignity of everyone. So I'm going to go through, and there's been a lot of work on the value of diversity to institutions, businesses, et cetera. And I'm going to go through those and some of which, but I want to start with a story. And this is the story of a woman named Virginia Tower Norwood. She was MIT class of 47. She was a mathematician. And ultimately, after working for many years, she invented the first multispectral scanner known as Landsat, which allows us to image Earth from space. Really important, really obviously very, very good scientist, mathematician. But her story, when she got out of MIT, she had a really hard time getting a job because people didn't want to. And in fact, and it's highlighted in the second block on the text page, the article on her that I read, over 3 interviews at Remington, she outlined her vision for how a staff mathematician could improve the gun company's operations. The hiring manager called to say that she'd convinced them it was a brilliant idea and that they were going to look for a man to fill that position. Okay, so I would look at this and say, this is maddening, but who was the real loser here? And I would say it was Remington, because they lost their opportunity to hire somebody to contribute to their business that ultimately developed Landsat. Virginia Tower Norwood didn't do badly out of this. She finally did find a job where she could pursue her scientific beliefs and invent stuff. Remington has now gone bankrupt, actually, as a company, but not because of this, probably, but who can say? So this gets into the first diversity value, which is wider talent pool. If you value diversity, you have a wider talent pool. We've got a lot of various things I'm going to talk about: wider talent pool, better employee performance, new perspectives, more innovation, and increased profits. And I'm going to there is a huge number of studies that support each one of these as a value of diversity to a business. Don't have time to go through all of these, but I will do a couple of examples that I found while researching this presentation, starting with a wider talent pool. Of course, we have the story I just told. And then not only if you don't hire women, if you don't value the diversity of women, you cut out 50% of your population to start with, but you also end up cutting out some men, because surveys have shown, or this particular survey shows, that US employees and job seekers will not even apply to a job at a company, say, where the lack of diversity among the workforce, and men are at 29% of men will not even apply for that job. You don't even have a chance to look at them. 35% of women won't apply for that job. Now, this is just one survey, and I'm sure the numbers vary, but when you look at if you're not valuing diversity, you're sort of cutting things down by half, and then you're cutting it down from maybe another third of the men because they don't want to be in a non-diversity valuing thing. And this is just about women's diversity. When you talk about diversity based on race or sexual orientation, you're getting into a whole nother group of people that you're cutting out of your workforce. You're just cutting down your talent pool, and you're not going to get the best people if you cut your talent pool down and considerably take slices out of your talent pool. Better employee performance. Again, one survey, inclusive teams are correlated with job satisfaction. People like working in inclusive teams better than non-inclusive teams. New perspectives. And this is where I get into one of my favorite stories. Le Corbusier developed a proportional system called le modulaire, which basically it was a way of dividing up space that was ultimately used to design a lot of the ways our city works, including scale of staircases, heights of door handles, etc. He decided to make this based on what he referred to as a 6 foot tall, handsome British policeman. I don't know what his hang up with 6 foot tall British policemen were. Don't know anything about that. But he said in English detective novels, a good looking men, such as policemen, are always 6 foot tall. Well, I'm not a particularly short woman, but I'm not a tall woman either. And certainly 6 foot tall is well above me, and let alone were I somebody who was in a wheelchair. So a lot of our cities, and if you go around, are based on size that is particularly for a particular size and shape of person. And there was a women's architectural cooperative in England called Matrix, and their book's just been released, that got upset with the fact that they just didn't think the cities in England were made for them, their size and shape. And they did some redesign. And one of the things they did in one of their cases in what was called the Essex Women's Refuge, it was basically a low-income women's living space. It was, and they were redesigning it, and they realized that the space was set up all wrong. It had a shared kitchen for multiple women cooking for mainly single parent families. They had a combined shared kitchen, and it was really small. It was too small to have multiple people in the kitchen. It was just not the right size for that. They had a play area, child's play area, that was completely separate from the main communal area. So you couldn't sit in the communal area and watch your children. And so they actually went out and interviewed, they went out and interviewed their customers and figured out how the women who actually lived in this women's communal living space needed to have that building built. Now they did this is back several decades ago, but it was unique in that I guess the original architect never actually talked to the people who were going to live there. And they didn't build it for the idea of single parent families who were going to be living in this shared space. And so they did the redesign. And you see this a lot in terms of if you don't bring the diverse thought and you have a group of people who are your customers who are of a different diverse background than the people doing this work, you see that there's just disconnect and the spaces don't work. When I first started working for DuPont, I worked in the textile industry and I worked in the carpet industry. And I sat in a lot of conference rooms, being the only woman at the time. And the men would be sitting around the table and they'd say, "What does Mrs. Consumer want in her home?" And I'd go, I don't know what Mrs. Consumer wants, but I can tell you what I would like. And I'm female, at least I'm partway to Mrs. And I probably wasn't listened to. But they would talk around. Even worse, the entire sales team for nylon and lycra that went into women's lingerie were male. And actually, most of the garment industry was male. who made clothes for women. So if your clothes were uncomfortable in the 1970s and 80s, it's probably because they weren't designed for you. Another diversity thing, diversity option I heard about this actually on an MIT Women's Alumni call in December. There's a book out called Atlas of Disappearing Places, which is a book on, which gives a visual representation of climate change and its effects on surroundings. And it's got some beautiful graphics in it, which are actually artwork that's painted on seaweed, and it's a lovely book. But the writer who did not the artist, but the writer who paired with the artist, Marina Saros was our guest speaker, and we were asking her, we were all talking about what the things we'd had happen to us as being diverse in diversity, and she said her biggest issue or biggest hurdle actually had been because she was a low vision person. She had low vision. And she needed to get over that hurdle before she even started dealing with the women's the women's diversity issues that we dealt with. And I thought it was very unique that her creative work led her to do a new way of visualizing things when she was a low vision person. And I think that, and I asked her a little bit about this and we didn't get into a long conversation of it, but I really think she has a different way. She values vision so much because the little she has is so precious to her that looking at ways of visualizing it. And this brings a new perspective into looking in the way she did her work. So the book is lovely, but it's also an interest on that. Okay, more innovative. I mentioned this survey before. If you have two-dimensional diversity, you can innovate and outperform other companies. Employees are 45% likelier to report that their firm's market share grew over the previous year and 70% likelier to report the firm had captured a new market. So diversity is correlated with innovation and new market development. It is different diversity levels. This is from a Boston Consulting Group study. I think this is the Boston Consulting Group study. Yeah. Looking at different types of industry, of different types of diversity, changing your industry, having people from different countries who had taken different pathways on getting to their career, like worked at different companies and different genders, all are correlated with innovation. Academic background mix actually was neutral. So I don't know what that is. And then diversity and age actually decreased your innovation. And I think that's probably because age is probably the diversity that is the least inclusive. Ageism is probably one of our worst, probably has the worst inclusion of many of the diversities. We do segregate by age. We don't include younger and older people tend not to work together. We do separate out. And I think that when you get into age, diversity and age, you sometimes end up with a toxic mix as opposed to having that inclusiveness, which includes the thought across there. You don't get that mix. I think that may be the case. I have to look into the study more, but it is sort of interesting. And now I'm in my 60s, I tend to look at ageism as another issue that I'm going to have to end up dealing with at one point or another. Increased profits. There's a number of studies out there, but there's a series by McKinsey showing that gender diversity on executive teams is directly correlated with profitability of peer companies. So diversity, and there's they did a series of 3 different studies over the years, and it has become increasingly more important as you separate companies with diverse management staffs from companies with less diverse management staffs. So what are the statistics? I'm going to go through these really quickly. US Bureau of Labor Statistics, so basically our government things. And these are statistics for last year, 2021. Total percent of total employed in the workplace, 47% is women 16 years and over. That's probably gone down because of COVID. COVID hit women harder, but 47% are women. So we're, sort of on parity in terms of total employed. Architecture and engineering occupations, 17.4% female. Only architects, except landscape and naval architects, 31.6% women. Chemical engineers, my field, 12.8. And mechanical engineers, the largest Ashrae field, 9.4. When you look at Black and African American chemical engineers, it's only 1.3. It's if you are a if you are a person of color or a woman or both, you are probably not very well represented in the engineering community. You may be more represented. You're more likely to be represented in some of the biological sciences. So overall in STEM, there's a higher percentage, but not so much into the engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, which is on this next. You can see how they've improved over the years. Engineers have gone up, everything's gone up, except computer workers went up, peaked, and went down. And that's because the original computer programmers were women, but then when it changed over into more highly paid IT workers, men took the jobs away. But for the most part, things have been improving, mostly in the social sciences and biological sciences out of the STEM careers. The proportion of women starting their research career widely varies between renting. So nursing, which is a science-based career, is up at like 80% of women, of people starting are women. Engineering is down at under 20%. They've all increased, but you can see that it varies, and you can see that the biological sciences and chemistry is a little higher than things that are considered, that are more mechanical, dealing with metal and wood and concrete and hard materials rather than the body. And that's probably a cultural bias that we have on women. I'll talk that. You also look at the constituency of inventor teams for patent applications, you'll see that individual male and all male teams still way outnumber patent teams from people who are usually on a patent. There's multiple inventors, groups of inventors. I can tell you that I have never been on an all-women inventor team. I've always been the single woman on a mixed team for all 4 of my patents. So this sort of correlates with what I'm seeing. And if you've got 90% of your mechanical engineers being male, it makes sense that the patents are in mechanical engineering are going to be there. So we also have what we refer to as the leaky pipeline. And this is, you get women interested in, and in bachelor's engineering in STEM fields, you may get around 50-50 mix of men and women overall, more in some fields than in others. But then as you get to master's degrees, PhDs, researchers, and ultimately to inventors, the number of women percentage goes down when men go up. And that's referred to as the leaky pipeline. And this is another depiction from the web on there, and it looks at different things on grants, on authors of papers. It just shows that lower percentage. And as they get further advanced in the field, there are fewer and fewer women. They just slip out of the field. And we'll go through some of the ways when we look at how to improve equity. But I think the first thing we need to do is fill the pipeline with women. And actually, this was the ad for the t-shirt, not the girl, but she's so cute. I put her up there. And so what do we do? So we found that boys and girls show similar levels of interest in STEM at 1st through 6th grades, and then the interest of girls starts going down. And So what should we do? And really the idea, I think most importantly, is to just encourage interest in girls. If they're interested in STEM, keep that interest going. Ashrae came out at Christmas time with Lucy's Engineering Adventure. And it's a little storybook for girls. It's a little thin. I bought one for my husband, and I bought one for our granddaughter. And it just talks on how a building works and how it works like the human body. And it's a little girl going around a construction site with her father, which, and it's worthwhile just giving them that outlook. KiwiCo, which is a company that does these kits to make devices for children. For Women's History Month and International Women's and Girls Day in Science, they put together these things where they had a Kiwi kid interview a woman in a field. So these things are around and they can encourage interest. The one thing I will say is that these are middle class options. They cost money. They're not what lower income schools can have for their kids. And so we need to look at how we can get the same experience to the kids who are interested in STEM at lower income schools, because otherwise you're going to lose that whole part of the population. And they can be enormously valuable to us. Okay, there is a study that's been going on for years where they asked kids to draw a picture of a scientist. And we have made progress. In the 60s and 70s, less than 1% of the students depicted scientists as female. And in 2016, that was up to 34% depicted their scientists as women, which I think is great that we've gotten to that far. So how did we get there? We have had more STEM teaching and training, more women science teachers in school. So there's more role models where they can see themselves as it. We have been improving that. And we've also had the increase in team participation in team sports for girls. Title IX was passed in 1972. I did not go to school under Title IX. I was well into, I was in the middle school, but by the time it got instituted, I was in college, entered college. The ability for girls to play team sports, really prepares you for working on a team in business. And a lot of us didn't have this. Now, I had the team experience because I worked on theater productions, but not everybody went through theater work. But the team sports, I think, really made a difference in terms of the women's ability to work on STEM projects and get through the engineering training, which is often a team-based education. So let's see. So we talked about the leaky pipeline early, and I'm not going to read all of these, but these are some of the reasons in terms of where the leakiness comes out of a career progression. And a lot of it has to do with stereotyping, bias, discrimination, lack of role models, lack of mentors, lack of flexible work arrangements, flawed meritocracy and career achievement. And they come in at different parts along a career progression. So I've put together what I found on how we actually turn this around and don't say what's really bad. Let's say, what can we do to improve things going forward in terms of advancing DE&I? So I'm going to talk about the basics. I'm going to talk a little bit about recruiting and how you represent yourself in recruiting. The issue of inclusion versus assimilation. Some talking about resource equity and how you should think about resource equity, what you need to provide equitably across your workforce, a diverse workforce, and the value of role models and mentoring, which I cannot. You mentioned you were doing mentoring as part of WCREW. I cannot underestimate the value of good mentoring programs. But let's start with the basic. Basics are non-discriminatory hiring practices, and basically you have to follow the law. You have to follow the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and you have to follow the 1978 Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Prior to 1978, the passage of a law which was based on a number of lawsuits, women could be told they needed to leave their job because they got pregnant, and they weren't going to be supported on the medical insurance because it was their choice to become pregnant. Therefore, it wasn't a medical coverage. And it's amazing to me that they had to pass an act in 1978 to get that discrimination taken care of. But anyway, enforcement of harassment prevention practices. And usually what companies do is they have diversity training. And really diversity training, in my opinion, is really to keep companies out of being sued more than it does in terms of actually promote diversity. There's been studies of the effectiveness of diversity training, and it's a short-lived sort of sugar high for the most part. People return to their original diversity standpoints shortly after taking it. It doesn't have a lot of holding problems. There are some programs that are really good, but a lot of the programs are not. So you need to look at how effective your actual diversity, the actual program that is going on at an individual. They're pretty much required by law to have, or for, so the most large organizations will have diversity training, but you need to look at what is in that training course and what's on it. I will recommend a Netflix documentary. It's an hour and a half long, called Picture a Scientist, which has basically interviews with several women who are working in academia and different science fields. And they talk about some of the challenges that they have experienced. And it's a good hour and a half of, you know, okay, so that's 3 Seinfeld reruns you don't watch on Netflix. You know, it's worth an hour and a half. Recruiting, how are you representing yourself? I want to go through a little history on how the sciences did represent themselves. So I'm going to start in 1949, and this is a painful image for me because it's MIT Chemical Engineering Practice School, and in their brochure they had this little cartoon, and it's hard to read, but it says, a factor not to be overlooked in the social life of the practice school men is the relatively large number of Oak Ridge girls who take a personal interest in making their stay enjoyable. This is disgusting and despicable as far as I'm concerned, but it was in the reprint in the 50-year anniversary of the Chemical Engineering Practice School. It was evidently in their recruiting brochure. I think they wanted to say that it wasn't way out in the countryside with nothing around, but it was pretty abominable. To 1981, and 1981 is when I started Caltech, and this was an ad that DuPont put out in recruiting. And I ultimately ended up going to DuPont. The ad is fine. It has, you know, a lot of things about career opportunities at DuPont, but the visual image for 1981, if I think back on my 1981 self, when I was starting in graduate school and starting to look at whether I wanted to stay in academia or whether I wanted to go into industry, I just don't relate to the visual of that ad. I didn't look anything like that. It just doesn't relate to what I viewed myself as. But I mean, it's a fine ad, and it probably represented what most of the people in STEM looked like at the time. But if you're perpetuating a stereotype, you are probably not promoting diversity. And one of the things that we find is that there is coded language. There was a really good study that went through, and I don't have time to go through the whole time, that talks about masculinely worded job advertisements and femininely worded job advertisements, and that you actually can sort of sort before you even, that people self-sort based on the language in job advertisements. And it's based on something called agentic versus communal spectrum of language, where agentic is to be confident and decisive, and communal is to be warm and helpful. And I think it's probably pretty obvious that men are associated with agenic, and the communal is associated with women. And I think the problem is that as you go through and as I went through doing job evaluations, performance reviews, agenic is what you always wanted to put on your performance review to show that you were doing well. And the communal side, which was associated with women, was not what you wanted to put in your job review. And if you put these languages in your job advertisements, as well as you base your evaluations on them, you can actually unconsciously sort and devalue the communal, because that's what usually gets devalued in these things. And they have a gender decoder on language, on actual words that associate with these things, which is really interesting to look at and view. And it's one way when you talk about inclusiveness and assimilation, which I'll talk about next. If you come as a woman and you have to gear yourself into this agenic male associated world for your evaluations, you are forcing yourself to assimilate. You're not being included for your full diversity. You are actually self-forcing yourself to assimilate. Nobody told me I had to do it, but if I wanted to progress, and I did progress very high up on the research ladder at DuPont, I made those decisions to use language that maybe was more associated with men to describe what I was doing. So assimilation versus inclusion. Remember, diversity without inclusion can result in toxic culture, and inclusion without diversity can make a company stagnant and uncreative. And I want to go back to when I first started working outside of academia to talk about assimilation and inclusion. And I want to talk about, I wanted to be a success. I was coming out of academia. So yes, I bought the Women's Dress for Success book. It was written by a man. He had a Man's Dress for Success book. He got up the New York Times bestseller list with that, and came out with one for women. And in the preface to it, it says, this is the most important book ever written about women's clothes. Well, not true. Because it's based on scientific research, not opinion. In one man's opinion, it's based on scientific research, I would think. But anyway, he says, women dress for failure because they make 3 mistakes. They let the fashion industry influence their choice of business clothes. Okay, I may be guilty a little of that, yeah. 2, they still view themselves mainly as sex objects. I don't think women dressing for most business clothing are viewing themselves as sex objects. He may, in his dreams, want us to, but I don't think they are. And the third one, I think, is actually even more toxic. They let their socioeconomic background influence their choice of clothing. So what he's saying is, this book, written in 1985, that was a bestseller, was you need to dress so as not to show you're female and not to show that you came from anything but a middle-class white background. So you basically have to assimilate, you have to get rid of your diversity. You have to meld into this white male world to be successful. And I gladly believe that our businesses have moved beyond that today. They now want people, I think, who show that they overcame a different socioeconomic background and succeeded. I hope that's the case. I think it is. But not that long ago, when I started working, the goal was making yourself not stand out as being different. And now maybe we're in better shape. But are we in better shape with resources? And by resources, I'm talking about resources in a lot of different ways. And I'll start with laboratory space, and I include management of staff, interns and support staff. There was a study of the committee that selected people for time on the Hubble telescope. And they had always found that men's proposals were accepted as a higher rate than women. They started masking who the proposals came from, so you couldn't tell what gender. And they basically eliminated that disparity between them. It's correlation. We don't know. Maybe the women's proposals got better. I don't know. But it seems to be a little fishy that masking it just eliminated that disparity. One thing we know that disparity in lab space started was there was a large report on the study on the status of women faculty at science in MIT. And MIT has always had women students, but their faculty, female faculty they didn't have very many full professors, and they were not treated the same level. And this was a report that talked about that status in terms of pay and other things. But what started that was a professor of biology, full professor named Nancy Hopkins, who wanted 200 extra square feet because she was doing studies on fish and she needed aquariums, and she was turned down for her 200 square feet of extra lab space. So she went around this institute, and she's in Picture of Scientists, and she just went around mainly at night because she didn't want people to know what she was doing. And she went around and she measured full professor male and full professor female, the size of their labs, and found out the full professor men had 2 to 4 times larger labs than the women. And this is across all of the disciplines. So one guy having a larger lab, maybe because he needed it for his particular work, but when it's that widely spread out over the institute, that wasn't based on what you needed. That was based on who you were. So providing lab space, internships, technicians in your lab space should be based on what you need for your project, not what your gender is. And just looking at that, that's probably unconscious. I don't think the department heads actually knew they were doing this. I think they did it through unconscious bias, but it's still good to look down and get to the data on it. Another big deal, and this has been a big deal for those of us who have to wear safety equipment, and it may or may not be a big deal if you're not in a field where you have to wear safety equipment, but I've got small hands, and trying to find work gloves that fit me, I had to buy my own. They didn't carry them in our lab stores. The attitude about women's safety clothing has always been what we call pink it and shrink it. Make it pink and make it smaller. But women's bodies, particularly if you're pregnant, are different shapes. And if you have poorly fitting safety clothing, you are inherently less safe. It needs to be fitted, well fitted to you. There are companies now that have put together things like safety harnesses that are fitted for women, and they have tools on how you fit them too, and clothing that are fitted for women. But not all companies will carry them in their regular stocks. If they only have 2 women in a company of 100, are they going to carry them in their stocks? And so it's a basic inequity. If I have to spend half a day looking on Amazon to buy safety equipment for myself, and the guy in the office next door to me can just go down to the business store's office and pick up what he needs. And I can tell you, buying safety shoes that you could wear with a skirt was very difficult when I started, and we were required to wear skirts pretty much in our labs. So luckily we don't have to do that. We can wear pants now, just get regular safety shoes. But safety equipment is not a new thing. This is a picture of Catherine Dexter McCormick. In 1900, Catherine Dexter McCormick was an MIT student, early MIT student. She actually, she was wealthy in her own right, and she married the McCormick Reaper people, the McCormick family fortune. And so she had a lot of money. She actually did not work in her profession. She actually funded stuff, including the all-women's dorm at MIT, which I lived in for 4 years. So I thank her for that. But while she was at MIT, she protested against the clothing rules in the labs. So she was criticized heavily for the length of her skirt because she shortened her skirt so it wouldn't drag on the floor, the laboratory floor. This is in 1900 when they wore long skirts. And then she fought and won the Institute's policy requiring women to wear hats in labs. And the hats at the time had feathers on them for the most part. And these are like a fire hazard. You could set yourself on fire. She found them dangerous. She refused to wear them. This is one of the few pictures of her actually wearing a hat in a lab. And the administration eventually relented and allowed women not to have to wear hats in labs. So the safety apparel thing is going on. And the last resource is voice, not being talked over in meetings. And this is something that I think every woman I've talked to in business has complained about being talked over in meetings. And I can tell you it's worse when you wear pink. If you don't want to be talked over, don't wear pink to a meeting because you're going to be talked over more. I actually did a little survey on my own, counted the number of times I was talked over in a meeting when I was wearing a pink suit versus another color. And, you know, I didn't do it enough to get statistical significance there, but I've talked to other people and they've come up with the same conclusion. It just, you know, so if you're in a meeting and you hear a woman being talked over, say, can you let Teresa finish? I mean, I'll say it myself. I'll tell people outright, I haven't finished talking yet. Don't interrupt me. But not everybody feels they can say that in the meeting. And so, you know, that's one thing you can do, just create that space for people to hear their voice. That's the most important part of equity you have. And I'm going to finish up with some discussion on role models. This is the Solvay Conference in Physics in 1927. Albert Einstein, Max Planck, Niels Bohr, the huge fathers of modern physics were there. There was one woman there, Marie Curie. And growing up, if you were a girl interested in science when I was a kid, Marie Curie was about it. Luckily, Greer Garson portrayed her in a movie, so she was actually quite glamorous, but she more glamorous in the movie than she was in real life. But and she won 2 Nobel Prizes, one in physics and one in chemistry, and her daughter also won a Nobel Prize. So she's a mother-daughter team that both won Nobel Prizes, but you only heard Marie Curie. You didn't actually hear very much about her daughter. She was probably it in terms of role models. And so a lot of us who going through our, you know, particularly those of us who've been in the field for like 40 years, like I have been many times called the first, the only, or one of the few. And this is a quote from a book called The End of Bias by Jessica Nordell, where she interviewed an MIT mechanical engineering graduate student. She says, "It sounds idealistic to be a pioneer, but who wants to be a pioneer? I don't. It's nice to be someone who comes in after the pioneers. It's like, fine in here, jump in." So, and she goes through an analysis of, say, these are the skills you need for engineering: technical capabilities, creativity, the ability to work well in teams, good communications. But to be pioneer, you also have to have these other abilities, which is being able to be alone, work in solitude, the ability to survive unwelcoming environments, unaffected by aggressive and disparaging comments, able to navigate a culture that may be downright hostile. And so we are asking, if when you're down at the 9 or 10% level, you're sort of asking women in those fields to be pioneers and engineers. Why can't, when we get up to the 30 or 40%, maybe they just have to be good engineers, like the men and the other people in those fields. And that goes for other diverse communities, obviously, as well. And so we need to get to a world where you don't have to be a pioneer to succeed as a woman, where you can, we don't ask men all to have to be pioneers, you know, so we need to get to that level. And one of the issues with being a pioneer is, well, you grow a thick skin, but the other thing is the imposter syndrome. And most women have heard about the imposter syndrome. I'm a combination of perfectionist type 1 and the superwoman type 4 and a little bit of the great mind type 5, which means I believe I should be doing things a lot better than I actually am. Most of us had to deal with the imposter syndrome. And when you go into a lot of the books about the imposter syndrome and the things on the web about the imposter syndrome, they're always on how you fix yourself, how you get rid of the imposter syndrome. Well, why not create an environment where you don't feel like an imposter and have those role models and those mentors around? Let's fix the environment, not fix the woman. I don't think we should put the burden on fixing yourself from being in a discriminatory environment you shouldn't take the burden of that as well as being the pioneer. And I actually started DuPont at a research laboratory called the Pioneering Research Laboratory, actually. And you can see that this was the mugshot. They gave you these sort of mugshots, and these were all of the principal investigators. And you can see there were quite a few women there. And that made my entry into DuPont and ultimate success, I think, a little bit better, a little bit more easily, because there were actually representation above what there would have been in 1985 in a lot of other laboratories. And then the other reason I think I was able to start on my career and move forward more quickly was one of the women was Stephanie Kwolek, who was one of the inventors of Kevlar. And this is an ad that DuPont put out showing her, and this is 10 years after she retired. So they were still using her to recruit women 10 years after she had retired. Stephanie was amazing. She had started working for DuPont during the Second World War, when where the men were in the armed services and more women got into the workplace, and she continued working in there. She fought to stay in the laboratory. Ultimately was one of the inventors of Kevlar, and was very supportive of all of the women science. And even after she retired, she went back and worked with girls in STEM. She worked on demonstrations for STEM in schools, and she was really amazing. And she was not a formal mentor, but she was an informal mentor, I think, to every woman professional in that research laboratory. And it was just very valuable to have her there. And I would hope that other women, I hope I would pay that back to other women, and that other women would think about the effect that they have. And she was at the end, this was 2 years before she retired. So she was at the end of her career in DuPont at that time. But it was a really just an amazing benefit to me going forward. So mentors, formal and informal, and role models are critical. And I would say that informal mentoring may be just as important as formal mentoring programs, because formal mentoring programs work if you can find the right fit, and they have to be well designed. But informal mentoring is something you can do to just everybody around you. And you don't have to be, it doesn't have to be woman to woman mentoring. It can be male to female, female to male. I've mentored men, I've had men mentor me, but just understanding what the issues people are going through and trying to help work with them is important. And the last thing I'm going to put about this goes back to Ashrae and its welcoming attitude. This is actually a quote from a recommendation letter that I got from somebody that I had informally mentored. I'd been a adjunct committee member on her PhD thesis, and then helped her get involved with Ashrae after that when she started as a young professor. And she wrote, "In what can sometimes be perceived as an unwelcoming environment to newcomers, a little kindness, attention, and encouragement can go a long way to making everyone feel as though they have a rightful place and can make a valuable contribution in communities like Ashrae." And I think that it's just a matter of reaching out, being kind, giving somebody attention and encouragement. And that may be enough to give people a little bit of an edge and make being a pioneer in any certain way go a lot easier. So I'm going to close with that because I think that's a really nice thought. And I'm going to thank you for your attention. And I don't know whether I went over or not, because I don't have a clock. So I'll ask for questions.
I know we're a little bit over on time, but if we do have any questions, if you can stick around.
Yeah, I can stick around. Yeah, this is the first time I have done this presentation, or second time. I did it first time last night. So I'm still getting the time caught up on it and getting it. Then I need to cut a couple of slides in the middle.
Yeah, so we can take questions from anybody.
KiwiCo. Yeah. Yeah, they're not cheap, but you can get them delivered by the month, like a new group, a new toy every month that they build themselves. So. Yeah. Yeah, so when I was at DuPont, I had met a number of women. They were mainly in the technician ranks, and they had adjusted service dates because they had basically been kicked out of work when they were pregnant. They'd had children, and then they had come back to work. So they had, maybe they had 3 kids, so they had like 3 9-month periods or year-long periods where they had holes in there, and then they had come back to work. And that is actually illegal now, but it has only been illegal since 1978. And that way, I was a second year student in undergraduate when that was passed.